Fantastic, fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for coming, battling your way through the snow and the strikes to be here. We have more people online than we have in the room, so it's a hybrid event. So I would urge all the speakers to make sure they're speaking into the mics, and we'll take questions from people online as well. But as you know, this is an event co-hosted by the University of the Arts London, and we'll hear from their Vice-Chancellor James Purnell in a moment, and HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, of which I'm the director, Nick Hillman, and also London Economics are involved, and we'll be hearing them present their findings in a moment. So there's very little to say from me, other than to say those couple of housekeeping things I've already said. Do tweet away, everything's on the record. There is a hashtag you can find on the HEPI account, HEPI_news. There will be opportunities to ask questions in every session. First we'll hear from London Economics, then we'll hear from Lord Willett, then we'll have a panel, but we'll introduce the speakers as we go. We'll keep it tight for time, so we're all out of here by midday. And I'm now going to hand over to the Right Honourable James Purnell, Vice-Chancellor of University of the Arts London, former Cabinet Minister, never for education, sadly, and formerly as well in very senior jobs at the BBC. James, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. No, I was never Secretary of State for Education, although the night before I resigned, Peter Mandelson did ring me up and say I was going to be, had I not done so. So that's a bit of history which my family would have liked, because everybody in my family is a teacher, pretty much. Thank you for coming. Welcome to everybody who made it here. The last event I organised in this room was 30 years ago, an IPPR event, and we worked incredibly hard to get an audience, got a great audience, but it's quite a big room, and it's about half full. And I got told off by then bosses at the IPPR for booking too big a room. So it's a mark of how much the world has changed that we can now have such a brilliant event with so many people watching online. I think we'd have had to cancel in the old days with the snow or the strikes. So welcome to all of you, and looking forward to today's debate. Thank you to HEPI for putting this on so brilliantly and switching to hybrid so elegantly. Thank you to you, Nick, and to all your colleagues for all the brilliant work you do for students and for the sector. You help us think through our issues much more effectively than we otherwise would, and we'd be much poorer without you. Our strategy, which we published earlier this year, commits us to, at UAL, to reducing and ideally eliminating the financial barriers to coming to study with us. We're the largest creative university in the world. We're the second in the rankings, top for undergraduate creative education. But we have an ambition to significantly reduce the financial barriers to studying with us. Obviously, that's quite a grand goal, but it's one that other universities can aspire to. Many do aspire to be needs blind. But obviously, they do that partly through the help of an endowment, and as a rather new university, that's not something that we have. So we very much rely on the student finance system to encourage students to come and study with us and to be progressive. And that's why we wanted to commission London Economics to do this report, both to kind of give us a state of play on where we've got to following the latest set of reforms, and also to set out some alternatives for debate and create a space for debate, both about whether further change is needed and what that change should be. So we were delighted to commission London Economics and Dr. Gavin Conlon to lead this work. Gavin is a partner at London Economics, co-leads the education and labour market practice, and is one of the acknowledged experts in this area. Was also the expert advisor to the Diamond Review, which is also covered in the paper, the reform of the student finance system in Wales. And Gavin is now going to introduce the findings of the paper. Gavin.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for everybody for turning up today and making the effort, and thanks to everybody online. Was particularly interested in undertaking this piece of work for UAL because, you know, the higher education fees and funding system has been, it's like Frankenstein's monster now. It's been amended and adjusted so many times that we sort of don't know which way is up. With the most recent response by the Department for Education after the Auger review, a lot of changes have been made, and actually we're at a point now where we sort of think that the sort of current fees and funding system probably couldn't be any worse. If I sat down with a first-year economics student, sort of said, design a system that sort of quote-unquote benefits the wrong types of people, then they would come up with this system. As James said earlier on, this is, we're trying to open up a bit of a discussion about potential alternatives, because the current system is really quite atrocious. It may not be the perfect system, there may be better alternatives, but one really important point is, like, if anybody does have better alternatives, HEPI have always sort of said in the past that there's no point in criticizing things without putting up an alternative. So this is an alternative. If anybody has a better alternative, please get in touch, commission us, we'll model it, we'll offer very competitive rates. Okay, the other thing this morning is the full report. So this is a summary of the analysis. There's a full report online, and it goes through a lot more detail and a lot more specific elements. So I would suggest having a look at that. The other point I would make is we're in a situation now that it's sort of generally perceived that the cost of higher education is almost unsustainable. And it's not really working. It's not really working for our students and graduates. It's not really working for universities, and it's not working for the Exchequer. The most important point, though, in all of this is part of this is really due to the anemic wider economic growth. Okay, so for 12 years, 13 years, we've had economic growth that has been essentially pitiful. If we had economic growth that was 1 percentage point higher, and if labour market earnings were 1 percentage point higher, we wouldn't be in this situation. There would be a pot of cash, and we'd be sort of figuring out which types of students should we be giving more maintenance to. We'd be talking about extending maintenance to part-time students. We'd be talking about a better settlement for universities for postgraduate students. Okay, so we have to look at this in the wider context, but we are where we are, unfortunately. Okay, so what do we do? So when we did this piece of work, we looked at essentially 4 different sets of circumstances. So on the left-hand side, we looked at the current fees and funding system. Okay, that's before the government's response to the Auger review. And essentially, this is a system where we have repayment rates of 9% over 27,295, and we have the repayment threshold rising with average earnings, and we have real interest rates between 0 and 3% pre and post, 3% during study, and then 0 to 3% after study in real terms. And the loan repayment is 30 years. The government's response to Auger was a reduction in the repayment threshold to £25,000. Okay, and that's fixed in nominal terms until 26, 27. So it's actually going to be lower than that in today's money terms. A really sort of quite pernicious element of the response by the Department for Education is to actually have a slower than historical operation of the threshold. So it's by stealth, it's essentially you're going to capture people in repayment. Okay. Now, I have no problem with individuals on lower incomes personally, on lower incomes making some sort of repayment, because essentially under all these sets of circumstances, individuals or graduates, or when they're students, do receive £50,000 in public resources. So I don't have a particular problem with people repaying, but I think the rules have to be sort of quite clear. There's a removal of interest rates, okay, real interest rates, both before and during study. And that sounds great on the doorstep, that we're reducing interest rates so the debt in graduation is going to be lower, but that has really, really negative effects, we think. And then there's an extension of the repayment period by 10 years, from 30 years to 40 years. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about the individual effects of all these different items and variables. But what we're going to sort of see is we're going to see something that becomes deeply regressive, and we're going to see a system where essentially the economic benefits are going to be accrued by the highest earning, predominantly male graduates, at the expense of female graduates and at the expense of lower middle income and lower income male graduates. Okay, so that's what we're going to see. Bit of a spoiler alert. What we've done is we've looked at 2 alternative systems. So one system, the step repayment system, is essentially within the current fees and funding framework, And essentially what we have is we have a small level or a low level of repayment basically at between 12,570, essentially the tax-free allowance for the first £15,000 of taxable income. Then it steps up for the next £30,000 of taxable income, and then it steps down. Okay, so it steps up and steps down in terms of the repayment. We've got a higher rate of real interest, maximum, up to 5%. And we also, and this is like slightly mechanical, but it's a small extension of the repayment period. We don't have this stealth tax in terms of operating. So what we do is we have the current system. We operate with average earnings growth. And then over on the right-hand side, we sort of jump the current system. We say, right, stop. And we say, okay, instead of having a loan system, we're going to just have a graduate tax. Okay? And this graduate tax is going to cover fees and maintenance. So essentially, whatever loans an individual was eligible for, now it's going to be essentially a maintenance grant. And whatever fee loan the individual was eligible for, it's going to be now essentially a fee grant. And there's going to be a repayment rate, and it's going to be 3% on top of the basic rate of tax, and then 5.5% on top of the next rate of tax. Okay, and we're going to talk about what the distribution effects are. Okay, so the current funding system. So the current funding system, we look at all undergraduate students, full-time and part-time. We look at any English domicile student studying anywhere in the UK, okay, full-time, part-time. Currently, to put a cohort of students through the system, essentially, with expected completion rates, it costs about £7.5 billion, okay? And that's broken down. There's about 1.1 billion in terms of teaching grant for high-cost subjects. There's about 2.9 billion in terms of maintenance loans, and there's about 3.5 billion in terms of fee loans. And this is the proportion of the loan written off by the government. So the RAB charge is 33%. Now, that doesn't seem too bad. That's basically saying a third of the loan is written off. Now, in the old days, it's really important to mention that this is after a change in the discount rate. So it used to be the case that the discount rate was 0.7%. Now, it's minus 1.1%. So if Lorraine's laughing here in the front, that's a sort of in-joke. But the point is, it basically says that the value of future repayments is much higher than it used to be. Okay? So now, but the RAB charge, before these changes in discount were made, the RAB charge was about 65 to 70%. Okay, so about 70% of the loan was written off. But with this magical change in the discount rate, it's now 33%. So it seems palatable. The proportion never repaying the full loan is about 88%, and the proportion never repaying anything is about 32%. That seems like a very high, in particular the second number, 32%, never repaying anything, never earning enough to actually hit the repayment threshold. And that's really more an indictment about the wider economy, okay? But that's for discussion. In terms of higher education institutions, they receive about £11.7 billion worth of income per cohort, predominantly fees. And then down the bottom we see average debt in graduation is £47,600. Oh, yeah, clicker works. And the average lifetime repayments for male graduates is £49,500, and for female graduates, £19,400. Okay? So you think that's our current system. It is what it is. If we look at the repayments by earnings decile, we see that male graduates on the 7th decile have the highest repayments. Okay, and this is discounted to net present values. So male graduates on the 7th decile have the highest repayments. Female graduates on the top decile have the highest repayments. Okay, it's slightly regressive. It shouldn't really be the case that men on the 7th decile have the highest repayments, but you know, it's not a shocker. It's okay. So it is what it is. If we look at the proportion of, essentially during the repayment period, the proportion of earnings that are contributed in repayments, again, we see this regressivity. So male graduates on the 8th and 9th deciles pay significantly less as a proportion of their incomes than male graduates on the 6th, 7th deciles. Okay. So that's what we have. That's the baseline. Now, a couple of really, really important features. And this is where the politics intersects with the economics, and this is really important. There's an awful lot of chat about high interest rates on student loans. And there's an awful lot of chat about, making the sort of retail offer at the political level and, connecting with voters and sort of trying to do your best by, young graduates, but by not burdening them with debt. So one of the responses by the government was to reduce or remove the real interest rate. Now, the problem is removing the real interest rate is having a real interest rate is one of the progressive features of the system because it holds the highest earning graduates, who are predominantly male, the highest earning graduates in the system for longer. If you get rid of real interest rates, essentially you allow the highest earning graduates, predominantly male, to repay quicker. Okay, so they will repay after 16, 17 years instead of a couple of extra years. Essentially, it's a windfall for the highest earning male graduates. Okay, so we're going to see that in a sec. Extending the repayment period. So as everybody knows here, maybe, it doesn't matter whether you have a debt of £5,000 or £50,000. If you have a debt, you pay 9% over the threshold. That's it. So by extending the repayment period, essentially what you're doing is you're holding in low and middle income earners for longer, for a full 10 years longer. Okay? So these individuals will keep accumulating, well, they won't accumulate real interest, but they will accumulate nominal interest, and they will keep repaying 9% for another 10 years. So essentially, the extension of the repayment period is going to really damage low to middle income earners. And then reducing the repayment threshold has ambiguous effects. Depends who you are. Okay? For the highest earners, it actually means you might end up repaying a bit earlier. For lower earners, it has the opposite effect. Okay? But if we look at the total effect of this, so what happens with Augar? So Augar, the response to Augar saves a lot of money for the Exchequer. So instead of 7.5 billion, it now costs 4.6 billion to put a cohort through the system. That's a saving of 38%. It's about 2.9 billion pounds a cohort. Bingo. Okay, so you're thinking this is an absolute result from the perspective of the government. The RAB charge drops from 33% to 18%. Okay, massive decline. It took us an awful long time to figure out how the government came up with this number, but we found it eventually. The proportion never repaying the full loan, 51%. Proportion never repaying anything, 15%. And that's declined because of the stealth tax and the reduction in the repayment threshold. Okay, you're just grabbing people consecutively over 40 years, a few more every year. Average debt in graduation, we get rid of the real interest rate, so the debt in graduation declines, £1,500, and that's something on the doorstep. Brilliant. You can tell people that we're doing something for our students by not burdening them with excessive interest. Repayments, 49,600 for men, unchanged. Brilliant, so you think. For female graduates, repayments increased by £12,600. Oh my goodness, here we go. Okay, now this is the 12,600 or 12,200 increase for female graduates. That's sort of bad. But the zero change for male graduates hides an awful lot. Okay, so we're going to see this in a second. So on the left we have the current system. On the right we have the response to Augar. So essentially, the removal of real interest rates has guillotined repayments for the highest earning male, predominantly male graduates. Okay? So instead of making repayments of, 56, 70, 87, 80,000, 73,000, repayments are now essentially 50-something. Bang. And that is the effect of the removal of the real interest rate. Male graduates on the third decile, teachers, nurses, now pay more. The net present value of their repayments is now greater than a male on the ninth decile. Female graduates, similar sort of thing. Obviously not quite as extreme, but we essentially see, a transfer of cost. Okay, and it's not in the right direction, I would suggest. Okay, so when I was saying earlier, if you want to come up with a system that was, if the exam question was design a system that could benefit high-earning, predominantly male graduates, this is it. Okay, this would be the first-class honours response. If you look at the proportion of repayments as a proportion of income over the next 40 years now, we see the highest burden is on the third decile for male graduates. and then it declines steadily after that. Okay? Now, people can sort of say, well, you know, okay, so this is deeply regressive, but we've also got, we've got a regressive taxation system. We've got a progressive taxation system, so it all sort of evens out. Well, you know, it's distortionary. There's lots of issues here about, you know, what's the purpose of this repayment system and the purpose of the wider taxation system. You know, there's discontinuities in the wider taxation system that should be sort of ironed out. There's discontinuities in, you know, beer and cider duties, and the government takes great effort to try and smooth those out to make it more understandable. You know, and the wider taxation system shouldn't be used to sort of correct, in some respects, a sort of fundamentally broken repayment system here. Okay, people will say that, you know, the wider taxation system is progressive, and, you know, non-graduates benefit from the wider benefit from having graduates, but it's also the case that graduates in the wider taxation system benefit from having graduates. So there's a lot of philosophical issues on this. Okay, so what might happen under a stepped loan repayment system? So as I said before, instead of having this jump 0 to 9% repayment at £25,000 or 27,295 as it is now, what we talk about is we have a 3% rate of repayment on the first £15,000 of taxable income. Okay, then we have 6% above on the next £30,000 of taxable income, and then it drops down to 3% again. Now, the reason for this is essentially what we want to do, and this is deliberate, is to hold as many graduates, highest paying graduates or earning graduates in the system for as long as possible. We don't want the highest earning male graduates to stop repaying essentially after 17, 18 years. Okay, we want to keep the highest earners in the system for slightly longer. Okay, there's two ways of doing that. The first way of doing that is to reduce the rate of repayment above 57,250. Okay, so you make it 3%, so you basically slow down the rate of repayment. And the second thing is to increase the real interest rate. Okay, because of the wider economic circumstances, this has to be a little bit higher than you particularly want, but this is what the modelling says. It's around 5%. Okay, so you have a step up, step down. Now, what is the effect of this? Well, this generates actually a small amount of revenue, additional revenue for the Exchequer. Okay, it's not just fiscally neutral, it's actually beneficial to the Exchequer. Small amount. The RAB charge, instead of being 18%, it's 17%. In terms of the proportion that never repay fully, it increases to 96%. Essentially, everybody is in the system for 30 years. You take out a student loan, you're in the system for 30 years. The proportion that never repay anything, it drops to 2%, so everybody makes a contribution. Okay? In terms of debt on graduation, it increases back to the current level, increases by £1,400 because we have a real interest rate during study. And then if we look at average lifetime repayments, they increase for male graduates, they decline for female graduates. Okay, but it's the distributional effects. So if we look at the distributional effects on the right-hand side, essentially, we have a system, instead of the guillotined repayments on the left-hand side, which is the DFE's response to Augar, we have a system where as you earn more, essentially you will contribute more. And that's the case for both male and female graduates. It's clearly the case that because of the choice of repayments to occur at 12,570, essentially at the end of the tax-free allowance, individuals at the very bottom of the distribution may pay a little bit more, okay? But again, this is a choice. And essentially the choice, when we model this, if you receive £50,000 as an adult to go to university from the state, you might think there's an obligation to make some attempt to repay that amount, or at least some of it, okay? So this is the infinitely more progressive approach. If we look at the proportion of post-graduation earnings that are contributed in loan repayments, essentially we move from the left to the right, and we see it essentially topped out at 3.5%. Okay. So a lot of benefits. And one thing I I sort of maybe haven't stressed enough is, although, you know, the lowest earners will be contributing a couple of percent, that's only for 30 years. It's not as if it's going to be 9% for 40 years. There's a lot of people under the current Augar response that are going to be contributing, number one, for a lot longer and at a much higher rate. Okay. Let's say we say, now this is obviously infinitely more difficult to implement, but let's say we move away from having a graduate tax. And again, I would sort of suggest you have a read of the main report, because, you know, in the past there's been several attempts at hatchet jobs of graduate taxes. A lot of the criticisms, you know, aren't really criticisms and they can be ironed out. You know, there are some valid criticisms that you have to take a policy decision to sort of say we're going to do this, but, you know, we'll come to some of them. Okay, so essentially graduate tax, how this would work is essentially for the standard rate of tax from the tax-free allowance, you pay 3%. So this feels quite similar. It's like just basically going across the line. This feels quite similar to the previous stepped repayment, because if you look at the rates, they're sort of pretty similar. 3% and then 5.5% on the top rate of tax. Essentially, the repayments are made, or this tax contribution is made until retirement, which is, we assume is to be 65. Okay? The really important thing about this is, in the past there's been criticisms of you can't have graduate tax in parallel with a loan repayment system for maintenance loans. There's no loan repayment system. Okay? So the graduate tax, what this is trying to do is this covers both the fee and the maintenance. Okay? So whatever maintenance that an individual was in receipt of, we assume that that essentially turns into a grant to the exact same level. And essentially the pot of resource is repaid through a graduate tax. So clearly, moving from maintenance loans to maintenance grants is expensive, because basically converting all the loans into grants costs £8.8 billion. But of course, you don't have any loan write-offs. The same goes for fees. But essentially, there's £16 billion worth of resource forwarded to students, essentially. In terms of the total cost to the Exchequer, it's about £4.6 billion. So essentially, a small saving to the Exchequer compared to the current system. The RAB charge, if there is such a thing, there's no real such thing as a RAB charge, but it's essentially the proportion of student grants not recovered through the tax system is 18%. So you could call it like a pseudo RAB charge. And what we see is that the average level of debt in graduation declines by £3,000 because there's no real interest rate charge, there's no loan, okay? So therefore there's no interest rate on that loan. And then if we look at repayments, they go up for male graduates, they go down for female graduates, okay? And if we look at the overall system, we see instead of the thing on the left, Frankenstein's monster on the left, we have a much more progressive system on the right, okay? So on the right we see, you know, essentially it's a stepped repayment system plus a little bit. So the highest earning graduates, you know, really do pay a fair bit more, but it is perfectly progressive. So this is what a graduate tax would look like, okay? So essentially, all we're saying is that there are alternatives. There are alternatives within the current system, in the stepped repayment approach, and there are ways and means outside the current repayment system. Okay, but one thing to say is, like, the Augar system, you know, it's sort of well known now about how regressive it is, and other governments have actually taken the view about not implementing the Augar response. So, for instance, the Welsh government has delayed this decision by a year because they are not going to implement or essentially adopt the Augar system for at least another year, because they're going to look for alternatives. So other jurisdictions have taken a view on this and thought, we actually don't like the look of this. There's a couple of things we haven't done here, and this is in the full report. Okay, so the first thing is maintenance for students is a real problem. Okay, and what we've done in the main report is we've also looked at, for instance, what would be the cost associated with reintroducing maintenance grants under the old system. And essentially we did that in the step repayment system, and it just means you know, a small half percentage, but you can do it, and it'll cost half percentage point in terms of repayment rate. One really important thing that we've also looked at is we looked at higher education institutions, we look at the Exchequer, and we look at students and graduates. The key stakeholder that hasn't been included in much higher education analysis is employers. Okay, employers benefit from having highly qualified workers, and instead of just saying, well, employers pay graduates more than non-graduates, that's true, but employers also receive a payoff. And Lorraine, you've written papers on this about it's not a spillover, but the benefits to employers associated with publicly funded training, essentially. So, you know, there really is a potential case about widening, you know, the net in terms of who contributes to higher education. And I don't think it necessarily has to be to the stakeholders that it is currently. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gavin. That's an incredible clear trot through a really complex and comprehensive report. So we've got a bit of time now for some questions. So Nick is going to be looking at questions online, and we will take questions from anyone in the room. Obviously, there's going to be opportunities to ask panellists about their views later on, so I would suggest that we mostly focus on questions of fact for this part of the session, but who would like to go first? At the back. Can you just say who you are and where you're from?
I can. Paul Jackson from the University of Essex. A question in terms of the maintenance grants and the conversion of those. Our experience at Essex, I think this year, has been fewer students actually wanting to come to campus, even though we're a campus university, because they can't afford, on the basis of the current loan level, to be able to pay the fees to live in accommodation. Our accommodation is not particularly expensive compared to London. Yep. Have you thought through the access to higher education in that context of a much more generous support system being needed to allow students from more deprived backgrounds to get access?
Yep. So the maintenance support at the moment is it's a bit of a shocker. Okay, no doubt about it. We have modelled basically a reintroduction of a conversion of loans to grants. Okay, that's one thing, and essentially the additional step repayment that would have to be made. We've also looked at alternative grant systems. So we've looked at what would it cost to introduce the diamond system, which is a hugely generous maintenance grant approach. And again, you can identify, it's presented in the main report, you can identify exactly what that would cost in terms of additional repayments in the step repayment system. I mean, essentially, with a step repayment system, it's sort of relatively straightforward to, you know, identify the additional, you know, essentially it's a transfer between graduates and students, you know, so graduates to their earlier selves, essentially. But it's all achievable. One thing is that maintenance grants along the diamond lines are very expensive. I mean, they're in the region of £4 billion. If you introduce diamond maintenance grants tomorrow, it would double the Augur costs, essentially. It's Great. A big price ticket.
Thank you very much, Gavin. And at the back, and I don't know if Nick, if we have any online questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. One thing I was interested in was your point at the end about the employers, and I agree entirely. Have you looked at the idea of something like an education levy in parallel to national insurance, something that maybe could be used on that model?
Absolutely. So we have modelled this. We've looked at essentially a graduate levy in a similar approach to the apprenticeship levy. So the apprenticeship levy, you know, I know it was announced by Ed Miliband many years ago, and it was like vilified, and then it was adopted by the Conservatives rapidly thereafter. You know, as a beneficiary, talk about the balance of contribution between graduates and the Exchequer. Employers are a beneficiary of the higher education system. There's no doubt about it. So we've modelled that, and essentially, you know, it generates several billion, a couple of £1 billion worth of revenue. The one thing is, what we've modelled is that essentially we've modelled any employer employing a graduate. The apprenticeship levy is for employers only with a pay bill in excess of £3 million. We didn't have the ability to identify those specific employers.
But that's not in this report. That's in a different.
That's in the main report online, where we've modelled the graduate employer levy.
Thanks, James. There are quite a few questions online, so I'll read them, but you may need to pick and choose a little bit, Gavin, which ones you respond to. So Pam Tacklow, who I know you've worked with before, used to run Million Plus, has said, what are the arguments for including maintenance loans in graduate tax, the maintenance support in the graduate tax, given that some students choose to live at home, e.g. mature students and others? Peter Brandt has said, have you estimated the cost to government of abolishing real interest rates? He says the DFE student loan forecasts imply it means that 2023 reforms don't actually save money. And Julian Gravett made a similar point, the DFE is cherry-picked from Augur. And then Mary Colonel-Cook says, could you say something about the low percentage repayment on the lowest earners? Wouldn't this be politically toxic and unsustainable for lower earners? And we could always return to that in the panel. Then, sorry, finally, you might have to pick and choose. Mark Leach from Wonky has said, have you modelled the unit of resource in the grad tax model, given an expanding cohort of home undergraduates?
Okay, so in terms of the last question first, we always apply the analysis to the 21-22 cohort. So essentially, the unit of resource is unchanged. The level of funding for higher education institutions is unchanged. They're unchanged throughout all of this. So the issue is about, on a like-for-like basis, there's no difference in the unit of resource. Going back to the other points, there are issues. So Mary Kerner-Cook talking about the repayments amongst the lowest earners. There is an issue about this, and I agree with this, that politically, and this is where the politics and the economics sort of diverge. Politically, it's toxic, or likely to be toxic, but the issue is, that's just the headline. Again, the headline, you can make the headline toxic. It's also the case that, you know, for instance, nobody's really talking about the Augur response in terms of the stealth tax and the slow operating, and the fact that over time, and over 40 years, you're going to slowly gather in more individuals into repayment, sort of unwittingly. So you can sort of talk about the lowest earners, but I think, you know, it's a lot more complicated than that because of the 40-year repayment period. The first question by, Pam Tacklow, in relation to lots of students living at home, this is a fair point. Okay, so we model this based on, you know, the average level of loan and essentially fee loan, which are converted into grants. Individual students, some individual students don't take out or may not be eligible for different levels of resource allocation. So there are issues that you would have to think about there. And the fourth question was, Julian supported that. And
yeah, it was about the real interest rates, the cost of abolishing the real interest rate, whether the Augur package has actually saved any money at all for the government.
I mean, the real interest rate component on its own, we can model that. I mean, we've looked at the package as a whole. But yeah, I saw the information that was put out yesterday, and I saw Peter Brand's tweets on it yesterday, but that's a fair point.
Great. So I think that's all time that we've got for questions, or do you want to go for one more round?
Well, I think maybe we'll put them to the panel.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much, Gavin. Thanks for all the work.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Gavin. I'm now going to turn to our second Privy Councillor of the morning, the Lord David Willett, the Right Honourable Lord David Willett, former Universities and Science Minister, author of University Education, architect of the 2012 reforms, and a long-standing friend and author for HEPI as well. So, David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. It's good to be here, and I think that James and Gavin have performed a service by opening up quite understandably the debate about the higher education funding arrangements. We have actually, though, I have to say, gone back almost exactly 20 years. If you look at the Sunday Times in November 2002, you will find the record of the argument between the Blairites and the Brownites. And the Blairites wanted a graduate repayment system. The speculation was with fees of £10,000, and the Brownites wanted a graduate tax, and they were arguing it out through the pages of the papers, and eventually the DFE put out a paper about why a graduate tax wouldn't work, which I've found from my files, and I think Nick is going to add to his archive of HE finance policy documents available on the HEPI website. So we did end up with a graduate contribution scheme, and look, it's not perfect, and I'm going to touch on some of the problems with it, but I thought that when Gavin said it's just not working, I thought that was a harsh judgment. He said it wasn't working for students. Well, students understand they don't pay up front. Students know they pay back as graduates when they're above a threshold, an earnings threshold. And because, thank heavens, they understand that, that arrangement has not deterred them from going to university. Indeed, we've had an increase in the number of people going to university, including from low-income backgrounds. For the Exchequer, it dealt with the issue, which I'm afraid dogs any HE funding system, that public funding for higher education is not a priority around the cabinet table. So they have been able, and Gavin's figures I thought were very useful as a demolition of some of those arguments I used to have, well, you haven't saved any money because of the RAB charge. So we've got about £11.7 billion going to universities, most of it funded by graduates paying back, but about £3 billion, £3.5 billion coming from the Exchequer. So the Treasury has saved a significant amount of public expenditure by turning to graduates to pay back instead. And then for universities, and look, I got a lot of this grief from the Treasury, for universities, if you look at the way in which austerity has hit many public services, universities have by and large found an alternative source of income, which has meant that the income of universities has risen through a very tough 10-year period. So universities have seen an alternative and viable source of finance. I think the problems, my personal list of the top two problems, and there are others as well, I think that when James rightly talks about removing barriers for students, the barrier I worry about is the cash costs facing students whilst at university. And my own experience in every conversation I had with the NUS in my time was that whatever the public argument was, that it was somehow wrong for graduates to pay back, when they were in the meeting room talking to me, they focused on the cash that students needed to live in, and they were absolutely right to do so. I think there's a real cash pressure now for students whilst at university. I regret the loss of the means-tested maintenance grant, and we need somehow, through either a return to a means-tested maintenance grant or increased maintenance loans, to help students with those cost of living pressures. That's the barrier, not the prospect that if you're in a well-paid job later, you'll have to pay back. And of course, the other anxiety, which I increasingly hear amongst universities, is, well, if fees are permanently stuck at 9,250, well, how are we going to finance teaching costs in the future? And the fear that somehow the system is now frozen is what has opened up this wider debate. Suddenly, people are, and only because they think the current system is frozen. Incidentally, if they thought it was not frozen, I don't think this debate would be happening. They think, oh, we can only assume we're stuck with fees at this level, so we therefore must look at all these wider options, which Gavin has very helpfully set out some examples of. So, what is the problem? What are the problems in the current system that concern him? And let me now directly engage with that. Look, I think, I have to say, and look, I had made my share of the mistakes, but I think a crucial mistake was when Theresa May raised the repayment threshold to such a high level in 2017. A big increase in the RAB charge, a big increase in the writing off of loans, so the generality of taxpayers paying, and much less being collected back from graduates. And only very high paid graduates paying back significantly or in full. If you reverse Theresa May's mistake by lowering the repayment threshold, there is no getting around the fact what you're doing is collecting more from the less well-paid graduates who were not going to pay back in full when the repayment threshold was so high. That seems to me to be an unavoidable consequence of reversing that error, because the very high-paid graduates, clearly, even in Theresa May's system, were paying back. And so what Olga proposed, and what in a different version of DFE has done, is saying the generality of taxpayers should not be paying so much. Graduates should be paying more, and we have to look at the graduates who weren't paying in full, and those tend to be the less affluent graduates. However, all these are, this is entirely a discussion about the half of the population that are graduates. The distribution of income that you saw in Gavin's presentation was entirely distributions amongst graduates. I chair a think tank, Resolution Foundation, which is about the living standards of the less affluent half of the population. So the low-income graduates we are talking about are low-income relative to other graduates. They are still, in general, above median incomes of the adult population as a whole. So we're talking about a distribution within the graduate population. It is also a feature. So in other words, and it would look a bit different if you did it across the entire income spectrum, not simply the subset, the half of the graduates. It is the case that if you have a graduate repayment system operating over years with some kind of constraint that you would pay back for the total cost of your education or a bit more, the rich graduates will pay back quickly, more quickly than the less affluent graduates. That is also another feature of the system. Nothing is perfect. The reason why we brought in the interest rates, and I can remember the endless agonizing as we tried to do the interest rates were the progressive feature of the system that enabled us to collect more from the high-income graduates before they'd finished paying off. That's why they were there. And as I said to James before in informal conversation, what struck me, and I genuinely, for me, having been very active in politics, and James would say, it is sadly another example of that tiresome observation that sometimes it's the most progressive features of the system which are also the most controversial. And the number of events I have done over the years discussing higher education finance or talking people through my book, and then all the anxious parents at the Hay on Wye Literary Festival come up and complain to me about their graduate children's interest rate on the debt. That was undoubtedly the most politically salient feature of the system, although we all understand, and Gavin is right on that, it was actually the most progressive feature. And for this, I'm afraid, a realist, in that I can understand, I'm not going to criticize my successors for getting rid of it in the light of the political pressure, but it has also made the system more regressive. That is regrettable. And if I felt it was politically sustainable, I'd love to see the interest rate back as a means of collecting more from the high-income graduates. And you could perhaps use that to finance do better on maintenance and cash for the students while they're at university. However, where I part company with Gavin, the big constraint, and I think this is, I have to say, a difference of principle, is he wants to collect even more from the high-income graduates. And I think the big question in any design of these systems is, can you collect more from high-income graduates than the cost of their higher education? How far can you push that? And interestingly, although I've talked about the debate 20 years ago, This really goes right back to the origins of graduate repayment systems, and the very first system was the Yale Law School model, which was designed very ingeniously that you would have a 4% charge on your earnings above quite a low threshold if you're a graduate of Yale Law School until all of your year's legal education costs had been paid off. So it was a system whereby the high-income graduates were going to pay back a lot more than the cost of their higher education, and the low-income legal graduates from there would pay back yet less, but the total thing would add up and balance. That system collapsed because eventually the high-earning graduates said, why am I paying back so much more than the actual cost of their legal education? And this collapse of the Yale Law School model is very relevant for a particular reason. One of the participants in it was Bill Clinton. And the lesson that Bill Clinton learned from that failure was that you can't, there is a limit to the progressivity which you can apply within your graduate financing system. That's why in his 1992 presidential manifesto, he proposed a graduate repayment scheme not unlike the one that we have in the UK, and why the progressives in the US, and look at the debate happening now in California, think our graduate repayment system is about as far as you can push the progressivity. Because if you go any further, you have two people in high-paid jobs side by side, and one of them is paying a higher rate of tax deduction than the other. And when he or she is asked why I'm paying more, it's not because I'm paying for the cost of my higher education, which I think is a politically acceptable and credible reason. It's because I'm a graduate and have to pay more for the education of lots of other graduates as well. That is not the Yale warning is that is not a politically sustainable model. And that is why Augar, and you can push it a bit, we pushed it a bit with interest rates. I think the Augar assessment that you can't expect people to pay more than about 1.2 times the actual cost of their higher education is broadly right. So I think there's a point of, and beyond that, you should expect the generality of taxpayers to pay. It's perfectly reasonable for them to pay, and you can decide on the calibration of your system. I think Theresa May's model went too far, expecting the generality of taxpayers to pay too much, but there's no particular reason why just because you also went to university, you have a particular obligation. You pay for your higher education, and then through general tax, you meet the costs of people who can't afford to pay back. Now, that's an argument of principle. There are also, however, some arguments of practice. And I think the most important argument about practice is one that's even more relevant now that we have much more granular data from the exercise, which I launched and which Anna Vignoles and others implemented and now is shown in the IFS data, to better understand the earnings of graduates. Because, and I think in Gavin's longer paper, he talks about the migration risk of graduates facing high rates of tax leaving the country. The migration risk is different. People will know if I go and study economics at Cambridge or law at a Russell Group university, I am going to be paying a hell of a lot extra. In the top decile in the model, I think it was about £160,000. And people will be able to see that. So we will have, uniquely in the Western world, a higher education offer that is more expensive than the most expensive American universities. And although at the moment I think he's overdoing it, Rishi Sunak and senior members of the government are worried about very low earnings courses and cutting back on those. This is absolutely precisely targeted on very high earning courses. Why on earth would you go and do economics at Cambridge or engineering at Imperial if you are taking on the high risks of very high tax throughout your working life? You can see the offer from Yale and Penn State and Sydney now. Come to us. Of course, you can go back, and that's why the migration issue is the wrong way around. Of course, you can go back then to Britain, but don't worry, you'll have had a really good economics education out here, and then you can go back and pursue your career, and unlike the mugs alongside you in Barclays or Goldman Sachs or Clifford Chance, you won't be paying this ludicrous high graduate cost. That's so what you, or of course you can go private. You can say, I won't go to it. I won't participate in the scheme. In other words, you do have a real problem of exit. It's not just an issue of principle. Now, there's some other issues, and we mustn't get bogged down in them, but the other issue is, in a graduate tax, who are the graduates? So can you apply it to people? We have no list of British people who went to university. You could, I suppose, apply it to people currently in the student loan system. And look, I have argued that it should be possible to adjust the terms of their loans, but I suppose you could try to say everyone who's currently in the student loan system, you're now facing a completely different tax regime. I think that would be politically impossible myself, given the difficulty of even making very modest alterations. You could, I think, and this is where the Blairite-Brownite dispute ended up, you could announce a graduate tax for all people, all future people going to university in England. We'll set aside the interesting federal question as well. You do that, I suppose. But then the Blairite calculation is it's 20 years before you start collecting back serious money. So you then open up an interesting debate about how you finance higher education for the 20 years before your graduate tax is collecting the money. I've got a great solution, by the way. Why don't you do a more now? Is the autonomy of universities. We had the other week FE colleges now entering the public sector, and the ONS stated that they're looking at whether higher education institutions join the public sector. One of the lessons I learned from talking to many friends in higher education, that they loved the argument that higher education was an incredibly valuable public service with very high public value. And when I said to them, why not join the public sector, they all ran a mile. All these people who believe in the public value of universities are extremely wary of any prospect of actually joining the public sector. We already have an increased amount of government intervention with universities, which I personally am very unhappy about. Universities becoming totally dependent on general taxation, which is in reality what it would be, and the Treasury handing out the cash to them as public spending would be, I think, probably the end of university autonomy in England. Universities would enter the public sector, with all the consequences that follow: control over borrowing, control over pay, all the rest. So I think that there are, as well as an argument of principle, why should someone, just because they went to university, meet the costs of the generality of higher education? I also think there are significant issues of driving some people away from the system and of ending the autonomy of universities. Now, what could be done? And my frustration is I actually think universities have given up on what is the obvious thing to do, which is to look at how you can recalibrate and reform the current system, because it certainly isn't perfect. There are things that you could do. And I don't think it's this kind of Frankenstein's monster. I don't think that. But I do accept that underneath the basic idea that graduates pay back for the cost of their higher education above some kind of earnings threshold, there is endless scope for deciding exactly how they pay back, where you set the threshold. And what I've called for before, and if I were in the shoes of the Labour opposition now, what I would propose today is I think there should be a system where there's an explicit, open and public 5-year review of how the system is working. And I see no reason why the Labour front bench, who, remember, currently have got, I think officially still around their necks, a commitment to get rid of the system altogether, when in reality all three main political parties were faced with the dilemma of how you finance higher education have ended up with pretty much the same kind of solution. But you could review it. And I can hear a Labour politician giving a very clear Labour rationale for a reformed version of the current system. I would say the system is progressive. The earnings threshold is set at median earnings across the economy as a whole. You only start paying back if you're above the income of the middle income earner. And one of my regrets is that Vince and I He'll have the 21K, which we kind of set against some forecast of where earnings would be in 2015. We should have been explicit from the beginning about some kind of earnings link. So make it a simple progressive earnings link. You only pay back if you're above median earnings. I think it is then reasonable to say that whilst you are above median earnings, we will expect you to carry on paying back, because we do think that by and large people should meet the cost of their higher education if they're benefiting from an income above the average. You could have a package to help students with their cash living costs, certainly. And if you can, I could even, not sure I'm giving this as political advice, but I'm certainly policy advice, you could say we're going to collect a bit more from the highest earners by bringing back a modest interest rate. We're going to use that to help fund a cash package for students today. You could bring back means-tested maintenance grants with that. So I think there is, and I think it is wrong for universities to assume that they, and then you'd have to say as part of that, we will also be, over time, indexing the student fee to inflation in some form or other, but don't worry, you'll only be paid back if you're earning more than average earnings. There is one other argument which I think universities should deploy more, and that is the link to research and R&D, and which the government may be very wary about putting up the university fees, but they absolutely love R&D spend. And if you listen to the Prime Minister, he's talking about all the time about how innovation is a key driver of growth, and he wants to see us spending more on R&D. That R&D, by and large, happens in the very same institutions as educate our students, undergraduates. And we all know that as the funding pressures on universities intensify, things like the overseas students who previously used to help cross-subsidize the cost of research are instead going to be cross-subsidizing the costs of English higher education. So if you keep on having frozen fees, the knock-on effect is that you probably reduce the R&D capacity of your universities. So I personally would link, and I also regret that we've got university responsibility in two different departments. I would link the proper funding of the teaching of universities and their capacity to deliver more R&D. So I think there's a reasonable case for a 5-year review to ensure that it's well funded, and there's a reasonable case of linking these issues to R&D. Thank you all very much indeed.
Well, thanks very much, David. I'm going to suggest you stay at the lectern, and we've just got time for just 2 or 3 questions, and I know Gavin wants to come back on you as well. So we'll squeeze in. We'll do about 5 minutes of this before we move to the panel. Who in the room, other than Gavin, who I will give you a go, Gavin, there's a couple of roving mics. I'll go to Gavin first, and then there's a question. Julia, here, Gavin. And then we'll go.
So just a couple of things. The first one is by not having highest paying graduates pay more, you're basically passing on additional cost to non-graduates, essentially through the general taxation system, a higher proportion of cost to non-graduates, which seems slightly odd to me, but I mean, that's a political choice. The real issue is you talk about you can't sort of, there's a limit to the level or to the amount you can ask highest earning graduates to repay. The real issue here is that you're assuming perfect foresight. The people in advance know exactly where they're going to end up, and they know at the start of their degree that they're going to end up in Goldman Sachs or Clifford Chance or wherever it is. So if there is perfect foresight, well then that's a legitimate concern. I think that's more a reflection of the lack of social mobility in the country, and it's becoming worse and worse. You talk about the risk of paying many multiples of the cost of higher education. It's already the case that different students pay different amounts for different costs of higher education. Medical students pay different amounts, STEM, et cetera, et cetera. We don't pass on the full costs of medical students to medicine students. You talk about the risk of achieving high earnings for graduates and the risk of having to pay more than the cost of higher education. I think that's a fair risk. I think that's a risk most people would be quite happy to take. I'd welcome the risk of earning £250,000 a year in Goldman Sachs, and I'd really love to take that risk on. Okay, the one point is, the other point is grad tracks, it only applies to student starters. University autonomy, universities don't have that much autonomy now. It's all a political decision about whether to freeze fees. And the last one is not another review. We have the Deering Review, basically is to kick something down the road before an election. It's announced after the election. The Brown Review is the exact same. The Auger Review is the exact same. We don't want another review and kick it down the road.
Thank you, Gavin. I will go back to you in a second, David, but I know Julia, I see.
Thank you. Julia Buckingham, Institute of Cancer Research. A couple of points, David. Firstly, I very much welcome what you said about R&D, but I do have to say as a postgraduate institution, it wouldn't help my institute one little bit at all. And of course, the funding gap for research, as you know, is huge. But I wanted to come back to the issue of maintenance grants because this is something that really bugs me. I think we have a terribly unfair system. A colleague earlier raised the point about students living at home. I can say in my former institute, Brunel, we went from something like 90% of our first-year students living on campus to something like 20% by the time I left 10 years later. But it's not just the commuter student issue. These young people are working part-time, more than part-time, to earn enough money in order to be able to feed themselves and pay their rents and all these other things. And it just seems to me we have a gratuitously unfair system where people who come from hugely disadvantaged backgrounds, for whom we are trying our level best to try and enhance their prospects in life, they then have a much, much bigger loan to pay off than the others. And to me, that just seems fundamentally unfair.
And David, before you respond to those, there's quite a lively chatter on the live stream about some of the things you said about research. So, for example, someone has pointed out, isn't the problem with the R&D argument that the allocation of R&D itself is highly selective, with a political potential, yet again, for some universities being allowed to have higher fees than others? So would it encourage even greater selectivity and hierarchy?
Right, I mean, I'm in favour of a progressive tax system. I just don't see, I'm up for, if taxes have to go up, and I think for lots of reasons, including demographics, taxes probably are going to have to go up. I don't mind collecting higher taxes from people at Goldman Sachs or in high-paid jobs. What I don't want to do is distinguish between, you were a graduate of an English or British university, and you weren't, so you won't be paying it. That seems to me a very odd basis for trying to levy a progressive tax. And it means, of course, that if you graduate from Harvard, you're all right. If you're a graduate from Oxford, you're not. If you're a graduate, if you're not a graduate, how do degree apprenticeships count? It just seems to me, let's have a clear progressive tax system, not try to use a graduate repayment scheme where the principle should be you're paying for the cost of your higher education, also for a wider purpose. You allocate instruments to objectives. If you try to use one instrument with too many different objectives, it collapses. That's quite a good principle of economics, and that's what the Yale example tells us. Yes, it's not perfect foresight, but that's why this data matters. We know in general, it's not one for one, but we know in general now from all the data coming out which are the high earnings courses, and it will not impede the recruiters from around the world from pointing out which ones they are and inviting people to make a different choice. I think that I agree with Julia. One of the other reasons why I'm very much regret the loss of the means-tested maintenance grant and the replacement by the loan in 2016 was that for the first time we can now say a low-income student will end up with higher debt than a high-income student. I agree. I think that is wrong, and it's another reason why the maintenance system should be reviewed and reformed. On R&D and allocation of R&D, there are two different kind of views of a university. One view of the university, which you get from across Whitehall, is a university should have lots of jam jars, each of which is to spend money on precisely the reason which a politician has decided is the hot topic for that year. And we'd say you've got to spend it on X or Y or Z. The other, and it's incredibly difficult to run a university like that, the other view of the university is they're great big holistic institutions. They're anchor institutions. They're very important for their community. They do a hell of a lot of teaching. They do research. They have domestic students. They have 4 different regimes for people from different parts of the UK before you get onto the overseas students. And the people running those universities then have a great big aggregate pot, and they allocate it in accordance with the strategic priorities of their university are set out, what their staff can do, what their students need. I still, and maybe this is an argument I'm losing, but I still prefer the idea of the university of the holistic institution, which, provided it is transparent about its decisions, is allocating its resources the way it thinks best. The jam jars ultimately cause the entire system to collapse. We have too many jam jars, and I don't wish to, and so I don't mind there being redistributive effects, as long as we clear what they are and what the reasons are for them.
Thank you very much, David. Well spoken, with a resolution hat on there, I think. So thank you so much. We're about to move to our final session of the day, but we might thank David one more time. So, thank you so much. So we're going to move straight into our panel session, which is the final session of the day. We've got the room till midday, so we're going to motor on through. I'm going to introduce our four panellists. The first one is James Purnell, who chaired a session earlier, but we haven't actually heard much about James's own personal views about these funding models, given he's now a Vice-Chancellor of a very world-class arts institution here in London, which has a large cost base, of course. And then we will hear from Viv Stern, who's the relatively new Chief Executive of Universities UK, but most of you will have known her from some of her previous roles, also at Universities UK, and is carving out quite a nicely outspoken role, I think, at UUK in these trying times. Then we'll hear from Lorraine Dearden, who's Professor of Economics and Social Statistics at UCL. I was thinking of Lorraine as David was talking about graduate earnings, and Lorraine's done a huge amount of work on that and many other aspects of student finance in this country and other countries around the world as well, actually. And then we'll hear from Jonathan Simons, who's head of the education practice, head of the ever-growing, I think, education practice at Public First. And I think you're just recently off the plane from New Zealand as well, where you've been looking into various things, and they have very similar debates to this in New Zealand, of course. We've asked the panellists to speak for about 5 minutes each, and then they should give us about 15 minutes or so for questions, winding up by midday. So, James, over to you. And please make sure you speak into the mic so everyone can hear on that.
When I was here 30 years ago, the session was introduced by Michael Grade, and actually the only thing I can remember about the session was him telling a story about Machiavelli, who he claimed was asked on his deathbed to renounce the devil and all his works. And Machiavelli apparently paused and said, "Now is not the time to be making new enemies." And that might be quite good advice for a Vice-Chancellor in this situation. But Gavin talked about the current system as being a Frankenstein's monster. In the Times yesterday, I described it as a house that's been extended many times by different architects with different plans, and there's a few of the architects in the room today, including me. I bear some responsibility for the original policy. I do think that it has left us with a system which is hard to explain and does have some structural weaknesses, and is therefore unlikely to be sustainable in the medium term. These changes obviously came out of Augar, but by the time they were announced, first of all, they got little scrutiny because the announcement was on the same day as the invasion of Ukraine, so quite understandably, they weren't focused on much at the time. Augar obviously had a range of goals, and value for money was one of the goals, but I think by the time the changes were made, I think there were two driving motivations. One was to save the Exchequer some money, and the second was to deal with the proportion of people not paying back. And as Gavin explained, I think those goals on the government's terms have broadly been met: a saving of 40%, a big reduction in the people proportion not paying back or not paying back at all. But I personally am convinced by the analysis which suggests that this isn't sustainable because of the level of regressivity. Essentially, if you stand back from the detail, I think what we've got now is a system where the government have flattened out the amount that people pay. So people in the bottom 3 deciles are paying more than they were under the pre-Augar changes, and then people in the top 7 deciles broadly pay the same. In the 3rd decile, it's about 60k. It goes down to nearly 50k for people in the top decile. So I think even just within that frame, the total amount people pay back within their lifetime, I think it's unfortunate to have that level of regressivity. Obviously, you see it much more clearly when you go to percentages of income from about 3.4% for people in the third decile down to less than 1% of people's income in the top decile. So for me, the case that change is going to be needed, I think, is made. Actually, this debate shows exactly, I think, the value of having London Economics' work on this. I think it does open up space for a debate. I think we're at the stage where it's a bit like a kipper tie, having a debate like this. There's a point at which it's pretty narrow, there's no debate, then you widen out, and I think we're at that moment of widening it out as much as possible, and then gradually, hopefully, there will be a narrowing down to focus on some particular policy solutions. I'll just conclude by saying one thing, which is actually I think what this is showing is an interesting philosophical range of views, and I would agree with David on that, that actually there's two different ways of framing what we're trying to do here. Essentially what the government's reforms have done is to relate how much people pay back to how much they got, with a bit less for people in the bottom 3 deciles, but broadly for everybody else, it's related to how much people incurred in terms of the cost of their university education. And given it's a student loan system, in name at least, you can understand why that is one approach. I think the other approach is to base it on a percentage of people's incomes, and the options that Gavin set out do that. We at UAL aren't endorsing one or either option. We're interested to see the debate, but I think that does broadly set the poles of that debate. And I would finish by just agreeing with Gavin that I hope that anybody who has a different view about either the philosophical basis of the system or the different features will come forward with other options so we can debate them, widen that kipper tie before narrowing back down.
Thank you, James, and HEPI is always a good place to publish people's thoughts as well. Viv, I'm going to turn to you. If I could ask all the speakers to speak about 3 inches or so, 2 or 3 inches away from the mic.
Like that, is that okay? And you'll have to also just cut me off, because I think that this is a huge debate, and doing justice to it in 5 minutes is possibly a bit difficult. But I think probably one of the things I have to introduce to this conversation is the kind of, you know, the things can't go on like this perspective from the university side of things. And I note that Gavin's work has focused on the effect that it would have on graduates and the equity of the system from the graduate point of view, and it's also focused on the Treasury. It hasn't really addressed, I think you acknowledge it hasn't addressed the pressures that they're experienced by universities, whereas anybody who works in a university will know very well we're losing funding and losing money on domestic education in England, and actually in all 4 nations of the UK you've got a version of the same problem, and losing even more money on research. So the FEC recovery rate is 95.7 for teaching and 69.8 for research, and the cross subsidy from international student income is becoming increasingly important. And David passingly alluded to this in his remarks, but there is a question, I think a fundamental question for us, about whether we think it is sensible in the long term to subsidise domestic education through international fee receipts. And I think there is a profound discussion to be had about that. And as others have said, from the student perspective, we've also seen maintenance loans at the lowest value for a decade, and many universities, I think, seeing slightly worrying patterns in terms of non-continuation amongst second and third years, and exacerbated by the rising cost of private rented accommodation. So, I mean, the kind of bottom line is, I think we would say from the university perspective, from the university finance perspective, things can't go on like this. Though I'm going to make a slightly, I have to first of all say thanks very much for kicking off this conversation. It has to happen. We've got a national conversation which Jenny Hyam, who's here today, is going to be leading for us to try to contribute to. I like your kipper analogy, your kipper tie analogy, James. I think it's a really good one. But I'm going to make a slightly, Gavin asked me if I was going to give a view on his models, and I'm going to try very hard not to do that, although I can't help myself sometimes, because if we're having a national conversation which we aim to kind of open up a discussion where lots of people can contribute views before coming to a conclusion, it's probably unhelpful for me to be prejudging that. But I would say I slightly sympathise with David's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I remember those debates when Tony Blair was trying to introduce the first variable tuition fee regime in a period where the Labour government had, I think, still very, very high support in the polls, but really could have lost that vote, and I think at one point made it a vote of confidence. A huge amount of political capital has been expended on getting us to this point. We've lost a kind of reasonably useful political party practically over it. And if you go and visit universities, around the country, I think there's a big difference between what you see now and what I saw when I started in the sector in the early noughties, after a very long period of unfunded expansion, where, frankly, there were buildings that had great big holes in the roof. You might recognise that from visiting your local hospital. There is a consequence to going back to the 90s and unfunded expansion. And I think we should be very mindful of the baby bathwater question. I probably don't have any more time, but I'm going to try and squeeze in just one comment. There is, however, I think, something that should really worry us about the way the current system influences politics, and it brings us back to the kind of quality and value question. I reckon the Treasury knows it can't afford the demographic boom that's coming down the line. And so there are lots of people in positions of influence who are busy telling anyone who'll listen that maybe it isn't worth going to university. And do you know what? That message is beginning to cut through. 48% of people that we polled in a recent piece of work that we commissioned from Britain Thinks believe that you might get a better job as a result of going to university. 48, less than half of those respondents thought you might benefit in career terms from going to university. I think they're wrong. And I think the people who will make the decision not to go to university because they believe the rhetoric about low value may well be those individuals who would have been pushed out of the previously much more constrained system. And I think that would be deeply inequitable. So there is a problem in the way that the current system drives politicians to try to close down opportunity for those who are the least advantaged in society. And I think we probably need to call that out, and I better shut up now.
Thank you. I want to say here, but I'm going to be a neutral chat. Viv, just before you do stop talking, how do people engage with the thing you've launched today, the big conversation?
So Jenny's chairing...
Where is Jenny?
Jenny is right there. She's chairing a group of VCs, but their job, and James is one of them, is to bring people into the conversation. Jenny might want to say more about how it works, because she's surely more expert.
We might give Jenny the mic, the first person from the audience, if you're happy, Jenny. Let's go to Lorraine, who is the proper academic here. Lorraine.
I want to thank Gavin for an interesting set of proposals. Quickly on the graduate tax, there is a reason that no country has introduced a graduate tax, and I do think it has problems of being badly targeted and risks funding for universities. So I really don't think it's a goer, and I completely agree. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think the suggestion of having piecewise, making the threshold lower and having increasing repayment rates is a good idea. I'll come back to that because I think we should be looking at the whole higher education system, including further education and vocational education. I think we need to expand the system in order to increase access, particularly for people who miss out, don't have the qualification to get to higher education. And the way they get to higher education is through access courses, through further education, vocational education, which is not properly funded. I think we have to design a system that allows people to get access to the system, and having an income contingent loan, which means that they could contribute through a fair system, is better. So I think having a system where the repayment thresholds are much lower with small marginal rates is good and progressive, and there's academic work that shows it's the most efficient and progressive system. I think there is an issue over the interest rate, and it's very, very complicated, but there should be a real interest rate. And I think the real interest rate needs to be explicitly tied to the government cost of borrowing, so that there's insurance amongst cohorts. We have the early cohorts have got a zero real interest rate. Then it went, it changes. It has to be tied to the government cost of borrowing, and that ensures progressivity. So how do you get money from the richest graduates? I think David had an interesting idea that, you know, they shouldn't pay more than 120%, whatever. So the way you do that is you have an interest rate which is just above the government cost of borrowing. So if you pay off your loan, you pay the full value. But then to make it progressive, the way to do it, and this is probably politically not sellable, but you should have, if you take out a loan, there should be an upfront administrative charge, say 10%, 20%. So if you had if you want to have an income contingent loan, you say we add immediately 10 or 20, say 20% to your loan, okay? And then you just charge an interest rate at the real government cost of borrowing. That ensures that any graduate who pays off their loan pays 120% of the loan value. So if you think it should be 110%, you can do that, and it's progressive. The problem with having a higher interest rate is that it is slightly regressive, because the students who pay the most are those who have pay the additional interest rate for the longest period. And if you're rich, you pay it off quicker. So therefore, you pay that penalty less. So it is slightly regressive. Now, this is very technical, but you can design a progressive scheme with a charge. And grants should be introduced. I think this is really important. There should be a universal maintenance loan for everybody. It should not be means tested. It should be simple, and everybody should have the same amount. However, there should be a means-tested grant paid to students to ensure those from the poorest backgrounds have sufficient money to go to higher education. The fall in the real value of upfront support for poor students is having an impact, and it needs to be changed. So that's, and I was just going to say about the Yale system. There was also a big problem with the Yale system about collection. With an ICL, you had the government collects it through employer withholding. The other thing that failed with the Yale system was collection. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Some very powerful points there, which I'm sure we'll come back to in the Q&A. Jonathan, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. So James said there's a number of authors of the current system in the room. I'm a sort of very, very junior administrative assistant to one of the co-authors. So I can remember in the Brown administration, when I was working in Number 10, and we were thinking about how to deal with the scheme, and as Viv said, it was a hugely politically thing, very, very toxic. Blair had only just got his reforms through, courtesy of one David Cameron. Never remember whatever happened to him. But the Brown administration flirted with these ideas of a graduate tax and abolition of rates and changing it around, and for various good reasons never went anywhere. And then the coalition came in, and I can remember discussions about what sort of system do we want to design. And of course there was a higher education funding review that had just been concluded and sort of suggested that we should raise fees, and there was a lot of political and economic debate about how we do it. And I do disagree that the system that the coalition essentially pushed through was a terrible system. I think James is right that it's a system that's been kind of built and amended over time. But it is worth remembering that government at the time wanted to do several things with that system, of which progressivity is only one. So it was a system where students don't pay anything up front, but graduates pay. It's a really, really important principle, and that is a principle we still have in the system. It's a system where lower earners are protected. That is still an important principle that we have within the system. Slightly peaks at the middle earners, as Gavin's work showed, but the lower earners are protected. That's a really important principle. Universities get cash up front. It's a vitally important principle. It's fundamentally the reason why every single time someone's looked at a graduate tax, it hasn't worked, because you need to do something to fill that funding gap before the graduate repayments come in. And fundamentally, we've never been able to, I think, work out a system whereby, because the Exchequer is not going to bear that cost, we wanted a system that is not within the control of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Again, it's a really, really important point, and I'll come back to that in a second. And we wanted a system where, although it wasn't at the time, we now have, as Nick has written extensively about, uncapped student numbers. I think that's a hugely important aspect. So I don't think we have a perfect system now, but I think we do have a system that has a lot of good features, and it's really, really important that we keep those, whether we make changes to it or tweaks to it or not. The second point I want to make, I sort of scribbled down earlier in the morning, is regressivity the only test we care about? Does it matter if we have a regressive system? And I was sort of tentatively going to say, no, I don't think it does matter. And then David said it much better than me and said it very politely, but nevertheless spent 20 minutes pointing out why it doesn't matter. And I think he's right. I mean, it is ironic, of course, that the Resolution Foundation test of the budget is about how regressive it is, and that is the single biggest thing that drives Treasury budget calculations. But let's leave that aside for a second. It ultimately is important, but it is important balancing against other things. So in principle, is something that is regressive worse than something that's progressive? Yes. But yes, but. We also have to have a system that's politically acceptable. We have to have a system that's economically affordable. We have to have a system that's understandable to students and to parents and to employers and to would-be students. We have to have a system that manages all of those things. And if the cost of doing so, literal cost of doing so, is that, dare I say it in a slightly arcane way, we have an argument about whether the 6th decile of men pay more or less than the 7th decile of men, and the 5th decile of women pay more or less than the 4th decile of women. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying there are other things that we need to trade off against that. And ultimately, I think I worry that we could end up in a slightly navel-gazing way where we as a sector come up with something where we think it's really, really important that the 4th decile is slightly better than the 3rd decile, but the cost of which is that the Treasury takes control. Because the last point I want to make is that I don't think it is true to say we don't have an autonomous system. I think we have a hugely autonomous system of universities in this country, and I think it is one of the best things about this country. And to show what an alternative might be, I want to talk to you about something called schools. Now, schools are sometimes, correctly by international standards, seen as highly autonomous. Schools in England in particular have a higher degree of autonomy than almost any other school in the country. But what else do schools do? They have a de facto national curriculum set by the exam boards. They have standardized annual tests, not set and not marked by the schools. They have restrictions on who they can hire and who they can teach in the vast majority of instances. They have an inspectorate that turns up with 1 day's notice and makes hugely high-stakes judgments on you. They can't cross-subsidize through international pupils, and they can't borrow for capital or expansion. Now, it is very, very plausible, as universities are often thought to moan that government thinks that they're big schools, for us to have universities that look a bit like that. And I worry a lot that anything that we give up as a sector to the Exchequer in exchange for a bit of funding today leads to restrictions tomorrow, and leads to restrictions on student numbers, leads to restrictions on autonomy, leads to restrictions on international students, leads to greater restrictions on research funding. That, to me, is a far bigger prize than a slightly arcane debate about deciles. So I really think it's important that we talk about the funding system. I think it's important that we recognise the multiple goals we're trying to choose, but the biggest prize is that we do not give up institutional autonomy. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jonathan. You started Brownian and you ended up Willetian, I think, probably. So there's lots of great minds in the room, and I've got comments online as well, and we are due to finish at midday. So we'll have a couple of rounds of quite snappy questions and comments, if we may. We're going to go to Jenny first, and then if you pass the microphone in front of you after you've had your go, Jenny.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed this morning. We wanted to get a conversation going, and boy, thanks for doing that. I'd like to just echo a couple of things. Vivian's comments about somehow the assumption that going to university is becoming disadvantageous. That's really bad for the country. And in the work that we've done looking at what people think about university, one of the first words that comes at is debt. So we have to recognise the environment. The other thing is that university sector has not got to be internally focused. Although we're kicking off these meetings within the universities, it is about all the other important people like the public, like employers. And I guess one of the things we've got to avoid is to be seen to be crying wolf because, oh yeah, universities are always moaning, actually they're not doing so bad. But the reality is we have a very heterogeneous system of universities. Some actually are doing very well, and often they are the most best placed to generate these extra sources of income. But a third of them are posting deficit budgets with no prospect of reversing that, and they're often in parts of the country where the university locally is hugely important. So I think that's another complexity to the discussion. And I don't think we should take a dose of what FE had in terms of we do need to maintain the university sector and the quality of it. And we need the discourse funding of the undergraduate bill being part of it. that we maintain politics and public to say that the support is necessary for the whole economy and frankly for the whole prestige of the country. It's something we do really well.
Thank you very much. Pass the microphone to Dinah in front of you.
Hi, Dinah from Goldsmiths. I think one of the things that really stood out to me whilst looking at the deciles and male and female student experiences is the across-the-piece differential in terms of what women earn and what men earn. And I guess that then links to points that have been made about looking at the whole system. I agree with you across FE and so on. But also the link into employment. And I just wondered whether anybody'd looked at modelling which assumed that gender inequality in pay was addressed in some way, and that also potentially women are grouped quite often in courses which are linked with lower pay, but those courses are also in Fourth Industrial Revolution potentially going to be ones around caring, emotion and so on that will become more important and more valued. So if in fact women earned more and were able to pay more back, then what difference would that make in terms of the funding and modelling of higher education?
Thank you, Dinah. We might look particularly to Lorraine to answer that. And of course, women are by far and away the majority of students. Yeah, Johnny.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. I'm Johnny Rich. I wrote a HEPI paper a few years ago about funding, a funding model. And I did want to, I'm afraid, go back to that and ask the panel what they think about the role of employers in this, because employers obviously are the ones who pay student loans back, albeit in name only, because it goes straight from the employer to the student loan company without passing really through the pocket of the graduate. And so what if we cut out the middle graduate in the process? The proposal I laid out, which was called Fairer Funding, do go back and look on the HEPI website. But it meets every single one of Jonathan's principles, and also some others, such as giving employers skin in the game in terms of the spread of what courses are available in order to meet future labour needs.
Great, thanks, Johnny. I'll take one more from the room, and I'm going to read out a couple from, there's one in the middle here, and then I'm going to read out a couple from the online attendees.
Thank you. Paul Woodgates. I'm a governor at De Montfort University. I just wanted to turn the subject a little bit towards the perception of graduates of the current system or any future system. Jonathan is clearly right. We have a system which does not require students to pay up front, and which their repayments are income contingent. And at a logical level, applicants clearly understand that, which is why they keep going. But when they leave, they're faced with a statement from the student loans company with this sort of eye-wateringly large debt figure on it. And because of the way the thresholds work, that actually very often doesn't reduce at any great speed, and may never reduce. And that creates a sort of emotional impact upon them. And I wonder if there is something we can do in changing the system that deals with that issue and deals with the way students perceive the level of debt that they face.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to read out 3 comments from the online attendees, and I'm going to say to the panel, you don't have to respond to every point you've heard. Just pick and choose the ones you want to respond to. But I've got a comment which is specifically aimed at Viv. Question for Viv Stern from Professor Mike Larkin. How precarious are our universities in terms of finance and maintaining high standards in the current frozen funding system and inflation pressures? So how bad is it, really? Mary Kernock-Cook, HEPI trustee, asks about the lifelong loan entitlement consequences of all of this. She says, in a few years' time, London Economics might have a problem modelling all this if students are borrowing one module at a time through the lifelong loan entitlement. So what bearing does that have on this? And then there's also a question about working while studying, which hasn't come up that much today, doing paid employment alongside your studies, which can deliver a 2-tier experience, especially if the number of hours being worked is, north of 20 hours a week. I'm afraid we've probably only got time for this one huge round. So let's go to you, James, first.
Great, yes, I think, is this on? Because it wasn't earlier when I was speaking, I think. So can you hear me? Yeah. And Mary's right about the LLE, and I think it's something we need to think about. I think it is fundamentally incompatible with a graduate tax, and we've spoken about this, because if the LLE allows people to take out £100 or £500 at a time, how would that be compatible with the very binary decision about whether people incurred a graduate tax or not? So I think if the LLE does happen, it probably is a student loan system or general taxation. But in any case, there's going to be a huge amount of policy thinking that will be required if we bring in the LLE. For example, around the B3 conditions and all of that will have to be completely revisited. So a lot of work needed if we do go for the LLE, which I hope we will. I'm going to agree with Jonathan on one thing and agree with Gavin on the other, which means disagreeing with Jonathan on one and disagreeing with Gavin on the other. So I'm breaching my own Machiavelli rule from the start. I agree that independence is actually incredibly important, having come from the BBC and seeing a world in universities where essentially the better you do, the more income you get. There's a huge virtue to that, and I do think that a graduate tax would make that less likely. Gavin is right that there's already quite a lot of control on the fee, but the fact that the fee clearly comes to universities, I think makes it harder for the Treasury just to siphon away money as it passes through the Exchequer. For example, it can start with, here's some money for schools for access and participation, or here's some money for, Ukraine is a crisis, we need to have some as an emergency percentage. I agree that regressivity isn't the only criteria, but I do think it's important, and probably maybe more important than you were saying, Jonathan. I don't know. It'll be an interesting area to debate. I think the fact that in cash terms, less well-off people are paying more back than better-off people is a problem, and people might not want to go all the way to broadly people paying back the same percentage of their income, but there may be something in between which is more progressive. And I think this does illustrate that there's a genuine debate to be had here, and different philosophical positions will bring you out in different places, and I look forward to the debate continuing.
Thank you, James. It's good to hear that a former Labour Secretary of State for Work and Pensions still cares about progressivity and regressivity. Can I just say before, you've lit the touch paper on this debate.
Yeah.
Are you now going to step away from it and watch as it plays out, or are you going to do more interventions like this?
It's a genuine debate, so I'm really interested where it goes. As Viv said, I'm part of the group of VCs who are steering the UK work on that, so I'm going to continue to take part in that. I suppose one thing I would highlight, and I agree with David, that actually the most immediate issue is the amount of money that students are getting in their pocket now. And I think there was some IFS research yesterday which showed they're £90 a week worse off. We certainly see that in London with accommodation costs. So one of the great things about the two options that Gavin brings forward is that both allow the restoration of grants, and actually you could also increase that amount a little bit. They have been forgotten in the cost of living crisis, I fear.
Great. Thanks very much, James. Viv.
So you might expect somebody in my position, in answer to the question, how bad is it really, to say it's completely and utterly awful and something absolutely must be done right this second. Just to pick up on James's point, we decided at the very first board meeting I attended, although it wasn't in this capacity, not to go after an increase in the rate of fee cap for universities in this moment, but to go after lobbying for increased support for students, given the pressures that James has just outlined. And I think it's just important to point that out. The second thing, and Jenny referred to this, is it really depends where you are. And I think the crude response to it depends if you can recruit a healthy number of international students or not. I was in one institution at the end of last week and another at the beginning. The one at the beginning of the week is rubbing right up against a kind of, deficit budget, and as Jenny said, a third of institutions already posting deficit budgets. The other one is basically fine, and the difference between them is the proportion of international students that they have. The other answer I'd give is, when people talk about the cost of teaching, I'd just point out the cost of teaching are not some kind of, thing determined by God. They are variable. If you want a system that sort of invests less in teaching, you can totally achieve that. You could have a system like they do in many you know, in many parts of Europe where very, very large volume teaching is the normal mode. Or you can have the kind of thing that is going on in universities right around the country where students have access to, you know, outstanding resources, to physical, to equipment, to facilities, to, you know, I think, so there is a question about what sort of higher education system do you want? But I do think that in an era of rapidly increasing cost, you know, I don't know how long double-digit inflation will continue, and all of the other things that are being piled on institutions, I do think there is a problem that is tipping more and more institutions into that kind of danger zone. And you can see that playing out in bills here. How are industrial relations in the sector, folks? And you can see it in institutions going through big restructuring programs.
Thank you. That's reference to Bill Galvin from the USS. Viv, is top of your Christmas wish list a new Home Secretary?
I don't know whether I should say this. This is one of those things, a little voice in my brain saying, shut up, shut up. I don't think Suella Braverman wants to go anywhere near cutting international student numbers, because I think that's why she got shoved out last time.
Thank you. Lorraine.
I would agree. I think you can design a more progressive system that's fairer and affordable. So, you know, it's complicated, but there are the parameters. I think there is. You know, I agree with everything you say, but I think there still can be progressivity in an affordable way that is not placing undue burden on those at the top of the funding ladder. In terms of females, I mean, that is the beauty of income contingent loans. I mean, they provide insurance. If you have a child, you know, you're insured. If you want to start a family, you're insured. If your parent gets sick and you have to go off, you're insured. The employer withholding part of the income contingent loan is wonderful insurance. You know, my eldest son graduated during COVID. 2 jobs just disappeared that he had offered. But, you know, yes, he had to worry about whether he could get a job or not. He went off and did postgraduate study. But the one thing he didn't have to worry about was whether he could repay his student loan because of the built-in insurance. So I think we have to build in that insurance in more dimensions in designing the system going forward. And I think interest rates, which has to be part of that insurance. And the point about grants, they have to be reintroduced. I think it's a really important imperative. The upfront costs that students are now facing are prohibitive, particularly given the cost of living crisis.
Thank you, Lorraine. So that would be your top request of the opposition when they're putting their package together. Thank you, Jonathan.
So I guess a couple of things. On Johnny's question about employers, yeah, I think they clearly do have a role, and I can't remember who it was earlier was talking about whether Labour might look at the apprenticeship levy and sort of broaden it into a sort of graduate levy or a skills levy. I can imagine that that's one of those things which could work brilliantly and could work appallingly. But I wouldn't be surprised if they looked at it, not least because it is a huge pot of money which employers, whilst grumbling, have nevertheless kind of handed over pretty quickly. And depending on how you look at it, there is either an underspend or an overspend in that. But you could well design a scheme that sort of had a tripartite, right? So the employer pays, the state pays, and the individual pays. And if that generated some additional cash, I think that could be potentially quite an attractive option. So I'm not averse to it. I can see lots of complicated ways in which, with the kind of complicated nature of work, it might be fiddly, but in principle, I think it's a really good idea. On the point that Paul raised, again, I think it's a really good one. I think this is a classic example where you just need a bit of behavioural economics, because nobody ever gives you a statement that says how much tax you're due to pay over your lifetime, even though it's a lot for most people. But you do get a statement from the student loans company which says you owe, I think, what is technically called a shitload of money, and it goes up for a lot of people. So it's like your mortgage statement. It's absolutely bloody terrifying. And I do think there is something about how you present that, because, as Lorraine said, income contingent loans are one of the single best public policy instruments I've ever seen. I mean, they are simply brilliant, because they don't push you into going into a high-paid job that you don't want to. I mean, the last thing in the world I want to do, even if I earned £250,000 to go and work for Clifford Chance. You can go and work in lower-paid work. You can go and work in passion projects. You can go and work in the public sector. You can take time off to have kids. You can take time off to look after your parents. It's a brilliant instrument, and the income contingent loan system protects you It's not a bug of the system that the state pays some of it off. It's a feature of the system. It's one of the most important features of the system. But I don't know how I do it, but something that stops people being terrified that they owe this sum of money, because in a sense they don't. Like the Gavin's number showed that. Most people will never pay it off. Again, that's a feature, but don't kind of terrify people with that statement.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to the whole panel for being so succinct. I'm going to call proceedings to a halt now. I think it's been a really rich conversation all morning, and I'm grateful to so many people for helping us be part of this. Grateful, obviously, to James and his colleagues at University of the Arts London, who've funded the work, kicked off the debate, and as we've all heard, I think that debate is going to go on continuing. So thank you, James, and also to Jav and Rebecca and other people at UAL that we've been working with. Thank you to Gavin and Micah, your colleague who was working on this transnationally, I suppose, for all that you've done, Gavin, to also kick off this debate and for you speaking today. I'm sure the debate will continue both on the HEPI website and through UUK and other places. I want to thank my colleagues, Lucy, Emma, who are in the room here today. You've done a huge amount to put this event on, and it's been an absolute nightmare because of strikes and snow and changing, to move online and all the other things. So it is the terms of trade have got a lot harder post-COVID. So really grateful to them, and also to Laura and Claire, who've been behind the scenes at HEPI as well, helping. And then finally, I want to thank our speakers, Lorraine, Viv, Jonathan, David Willis, obviously, in the previous session, and all of you for coming. And I'm going to pause all there, but also give James 30 seconds to wind up any way you'd like to, James.
No, just say thank you again to you. Thank you to everybody for making it. It does feel like it's a good time to start debating this philosophically and then to narrow down later on. So we look forward to further contributions. But thank you to everybody for coming, and to all of our speakers and to Gavin and colleagues for doing all the hard work.
Happy Christmas. Thank you.